Welcome to another episode of Think Tank Tuesday, where we meet once or twice a month to just discuss the concepts, the precepts, and the principles of God. Now, I want to start this off by reading Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15 through 16, where it says, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, for one who is in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in the time of need." Now, I want to draw our attention to that term high priest, right? Because a high priest is simply the middleman and the mediator between God and the nation. Jesus Christ now became the last and the final high priest, because being a priest in the kingdom is a political position to point the people toward God, toward God's way, and toward God's standards. A high priest position was actually focused on community leadership, which leads to national development. Like when we think of high priest, we think, religiously, but being a high priest is actually like a political position, because a high priest is solely focused on community leadership, which leads to national development. And this is important for national development because it gives the nation a direction. And so based on Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15 through 16, we should now realize that we have a king who can relate to our human experience. We have Jesus, who is our king, who can relate to our human experience, because most of all, people in high political positions, especially in kingship, are ignorant of the experience of the downtrodden, resulting in a disconnect. See, most kings and people in high political positions are literally disconnected from the reality of the world, because they have all of these luxuries. They have no worries. The government provides for them and all of this other stuff, that they don't understand the plight that the boots on the ground have to see, experience, or deal with. It's almost just like if you had a general who's never actually been out in the war field, but they just looking at war on a TV screen or a monitor and don't understand why things are happening. It's because they don't have experience of being in the field. They don't have experience with being boots on the ground. And so because when you are disconnected from that, you have a total disconnection from reality. But we have a king. We have Jesus Christ, because remember, Christ in the Hebraic language means that Christ is literally a political term, which means anointed one. And anointed one in the Hebraic language means that it is someone, when someone is anointed, that means that they are poised and positioned for a high-ranking government position. So when we say Jesus Christ, we're saying that Jesus has a high-ranking position in his own government. So we have a king who lowered himself to the makings of a mere man to feel what we feel, to experience what we experience, to die in a way that we have to give our bodies over to death. We have a king that has experienced what we have experienced. He literally has died in a way that we have to die, in a way that we have to give our bodies over to death. And he felt it and he experienced it all. But in his experience, he did not fall short of the standard of his father, the sovereign king. As a matter of fact, the greatest help you can ever receive is from a person who has overcome what you're going through. The greatest help you can ever receive from a person who has overcome what you're going through, the greatest help you can ever receive is from a person who has overcome what you are going through. Because wisdom teaches that if you struggle in an area, you need to connect with someone who has overcome that area. That's what wisdom teaches. Wisdom teaches that if you struggle in an area, you need to connect with someone who is an overcomer in that area. Why? Because you need to see what victory looks like. And you need to see what the standard looks like. And this requires us not to think of ourselves higher than we ought. That's what it says in Romans chapter 12, verse 3. Romans chapter 12, verse 3 says, For by the grace given to me, I say to each and every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the faith that God has distributed to each of you. And my mentor taught my wife and I privately about sin, right? Like he taught us like the sin definition and, just kind of how that relates to the kingdom. And sin in the Greek language is simply missing the mark and the aim of life. Very simply put, sin is simply missing the mark and the aim of life. So what we consider sin, which it is simply missing the aim and direction of life in our decision making. That's simply what sin is. We're simply missing the aim and the direction of life in our decision making, because entering into kingdom living, into kingdom culture, requires that you elevate your standards to the standards of the king. A king is a ruler. So because he is a ruler, that means that he sets the measurement and the metric for living. You don't get to create your own standard and metric for living. No, God is a king. He's sovereign king. Jesus is king. And as one, they've set the standard and metric for living. And it is your responsibility to discipline your life in a way that conforms to the way of the king. This is what it means to be a disciple of Jesus, the king. Because as a matter of fact, when the universal measurement and metric system was created, the idea behind it was this: for all people, for all times. That was the idea behind the universal measurement and metric system. For all people, for all times. And the standard and measurement of God is for all people and for all times, if I may put it that way. Because in our democracy, we like to say times change to promote sin that goes against our nature as humans, or the value of God's word, and against the value of God's law and God's standard. And although times do change, God does not. God's standard is generational. God's standard is transgenerational and fits for any period and for any time. Going back to the metric and measurement system, before it was almost universal, right? Everyone had their own measurement system, which left room for quantity manipulation and misunderstandings. The weight of a grain or the length of a hand would vary in different places. So there needed to be one universal system that was fair. When the measurement and metric system became almost universal, where you're from no longer mattered. How you used to weigh things no longer mattered. And judgments became fair because the standard was the standard and there was no variation. Regarding a standard for all, it promotes global conformity and trends our nation towards positive development. And in America, we're scattered because of segregation, because of groups, and by tax brackets and by political party. But God's standard supersedes all of that. So when we understand the universal metric system and how, you had different people that had different measurements, the weight, the grain weight was different, the length of somebody's hand was different. So somebody may say it's this measurement, somebody else may say it's different. So when you have all of these scattered ideologies, you create a bunch of dysfunction. And that's what it looks like in our world today, that it's a bunch of dysfunction. Even in the American church is not exempt. And I'm not talking about Christ, the bride. I'm talking about the church in terms of leadership. I'm talking about the church in terms of leadership at the hands of man. It's all scattered. Everybody got differentiating opinions. Everybody has different standards. God said, no, in my kingdom, there's not varying standards. It's only one standard. That's why 1 John chapter 5, verse 3, New King James Version says, for this is the love of God, that we keep his commands and that his commandments are not burdensome. Because we have to understand that God's standard is a standard for all people. It doesn't matter your race. It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. It doesn't matter where you're from. God's standard is universal because he set the measure and the metric for our living experience. And it's on us to fall in line with his kingdom, to follow Jesus and look at Jesus's life and look at how he handled things and look at how he carried himself. Look how he responded to things. And it's on us to take on that same identity. So that way, we can be effective in our living experience, and we can live up to the standard of God. Because remember, Jesus Christ is the high priest. And because he's the high priest, he's the last and the final high priest, we now have an opportunity to live on the standard of God. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you enjoyed this Think Tank Tuesday. And until next time, peace.